Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. Two guys interviewed me, Mark Armour and Jason Schwartz, that I know from SABR, and they wanted to follow up with going deeper into the long ago history of the hobby. And I said, that sounds cool. Let's let her rip. We went for an hour and a half. Now, this is the first 20 minutes trying to edit it. Thanks sponsors, Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication, ComC.com, Burbank Sports Cards, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, Heritage Auctions, Huggins Scott Auctions, Topps, Upper Deck, and Panini. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Jason. You guys love cards and you love baseball. So here it is.
I think in 2018 or 19, or maybe even 2017, Keith Olbermann spoke at one of the SABR conventions, and he talked about the idea that almost all of the founders were card collectors also. Some of them fairly prominent and others just like a closet hobby, but all of this goes together, right? People who
in the early 70s, there were hardly any conventions, so collectors didn't necessarily know each other. And probably there wasn't even such a thing as sabermetricians, but how they got together in the early 70s and knew about each other, it just had to be word of mouth and very small. Like I said, I was part of helping it blossom, as were the SABR founders. Next thing you know, you look up, it's been 50 plus years. Wow, lots happened, and it's mostly really good.
When did you start collecting as a kid?
When I was 7, my dad pulled over on the side of the road. My dad had been a collector when he was a kid, and we were on a family vacation. I just turned 7, 1956.
Okay. I asked that question because a lot of what I'm interested in personally has to do with how someone collected at the time, because I started collecting maybe a dozen years after that. And I was a set guy immediately, and I remained a set guy. But I could talk forever about cards in 1969 or 1970. But in terms of how people actually collected cards in 1956, 1957, I don't really know, because most of the things you read about that time is much more retrospective. It's what are the cards that people want today from those years. But that is not necessarily the same as what an 8-year-old wanted to pull from his pack in 1958.
The starting point is not as important as how it evolved. And the other thing that was beautiful now, it was awkward at the time, we moved a lot. And so how to collect or how kids collected, I got a chance to see every year we moved to a different neighborhood or a different city. My dad was getting promoted, so it wasn't a horrible deal, but I'm changing schools. But always, most of the dudes, the boys, were into cards and almost exclusively baseball in the 50s. But they collected slightly differently, but not drastically different. They had some different flipping games. And if I had something that we did it this way, where I came from, they'd say, that's interesting, let's do that, or that's stupid, as boys would tell one another. So there wasn't one right answer, more than one way to organize your cards, more than one way to acquire cards, to flip them, to trade them. There were different trade protocols, I would say, in the different places.
How a kid navigated the two company model in the early 50s. Because I've met people years later that said, I was a Bowman guy. So I've always wanted to know, if you're a Bowman guy, how did you deal with the fact that there was no Ted Williams or no somebody else? Or if you're a Topps guy, same thing. But if you started in 56, then you missed that as a first-hand collector.
Yeah, but when I'm a kid, because I was in the Pittsburgh area, there were rumors that the famous Denora, Pennsylvania, St. Louis Cardinal, Stan Musial, who was huge in that day, as well as in that area, probably every area, that somebody had some Stan Musial cards. And that would have been impossible for Topps.
Right.
And so there were rumors of the existence of these smaller cards in some cases. And occasionally in some neighborhoods you'd see them, but it was mainly a hobby about the current year cards. Even the previous year cards, right, they really weren't trade material. They weren't necessarily thrown out. It just wasn't part of what you brought to school or what you brought over to the other kid's house when you were trading.
So would a kid then have seen a checklist in 1957 for Series 3 and said, maybe Stan Musial is going to be in this, and then found out, now he's not in this one either? Because you wouldn't have known, right? You wouldn't have known there was never going to be a Stan Musial.
Let me answer that in a couple different ways. Number one, the 57 and 56 tops, those checklists were hen's teeth. They were like short printed and they were
Right.
not held in high esteem. That was not a trade worthy card. There's no pictures on it. And scouring the checklist cards to see who's in that series, I don't remember anybody doing that.
I never did it either.
Even Topps continued giving the checklist for the next series. I just don't remember people saying, hey, next series is such and such, because you had no control over that. You'd go to your corner store and they either had series 2 or series 3 or series 1, whatever they had. They would miss a series every once in a while. And kids in the neighborhood say, hey, guess what? Series 2 just came in. And that
Right.
generally meant that series 1 had sold out, or series 2, series 3, and they'd say who they got. So then you'd run down there and for a few weeks, those would be the cards. I don't think there was a lot of reordering. The other thing, just to finish out this Stan Musial segment, is the biggest news in 58 was the Stan Musial All-Star card in the last series. And Mantle was in there too, but Stan Musial was the man. And it was a triple print. We didn't know that at the time, but really there was so much pent up demand for Stan the Man. That was a huge deal. Perhaps in response that Mantle and Musial were the two National and American League famous players. Yet living in Pittsburgh, Clemente was the guy. The street cred was Roberto Clemente, more so than Mantle. And Clemente hadn't hit the big time nationally, probably till you get to 1960 with the World Series. He just was misunderstood. But if you lived in Pittsburgh and you saw him play every day, this guy was just amazing.
So Clemente was a desired, beloved card even before he became a star, which would be
he was untradeable,
61.
untradeable in the neighborhoods I was in. Now, when I moved to the Chicago area, no problem. Yeah. But again, kids mostly were trading their duplicate. They frequently traded one for one, but it was your dupes for my dupes. It wasn't, maybe if they got down to needing a last card, they would try to make some kind of overwhelming trade offer that I'll give you a whole bunch of cards for this last card. And again, remember at the end of the year, the value of the complete set goes to zero. The day after the World Series is over. Not exactly, but really there was no secondary market to speak of. But most of the guys, Mark, I think were organizing. Most people that have followed my career would know I'm a numbers guy, but I think more often than not, the kids in the neighborhood were organizing by teams. In fact, you'll find from cards in the 50s, a lot of cross out team designations, because if somebody got traded in the middle of the year or after the cards came out, they'd scratch out, he's not a Pirate anymore. And they would hand write in and mess up the card. But a lot of it was keeping it in team order. I probably vacillated. I never put them in alphabetical order, but normally numerical order. Actually, the more I got, I probably moved toward numerical order. But in less than half a set, it might be by teams, and I would try to get all the Pirates or all the White Sox or all the Cubs.
As a big Clemente fan as a kid, were you or maybe some of your friends interested in having 2 or 3 or 4 of, let's say, a 1957 Roberto Clemente, or was that just considered silly? And once you had one, you check it off and you move on.
It might even be considered unsporting. If you had 3 and somebody needed one, you'd look like a jerk because there was no thought that, hey, these are valuable. Now, would you say I want 2 for 1? Yeah, you might do that, but nowadays it'd be 1,000 for 1 if it's in mint condition. The values are so exaggeratedly stretched out of shape. Playground sensibilities were more like back in the day, general managers of trading. You'd trade 2 or 3 good players for 1 better player, but there weren't draft picks in those days as much. Bonus babies were mostly busts. So like I've said, the tracking of SABR, which didn't exist at the time, or organized card collecting, which probably didn't exist at the time, they were still fans and students of baseball. Remember, box scores were in the newspapers and there were no West Coast baseball. So you're basically getting all the box scores. And there wasn't as much night baseball and radio, so you could listen. So these kids were tracking the sport. But it wasn't like this player's hot, therefore I want his card, as much as I want to get all the cards of my team or of the set or whatever. it was more buying the cards than trading, because trading was more 1 for 1 or 10 for 10. So you weren't going to get more cards by trading. You were just going to get different cards. Because I've never really thought about that way. How did I get so many cards? Because I don't remember buying. I remember some guys that quit collecting. And I said, if you ever quit collecting, I'd like your cards because I'm really into it. And I was a new kid. Maybe they had pity on me. I don't know. And I was a good flipper. So I won a bunch of cards flipping of the games of skill there. On the other hand, that does damage the corners. But we didn't care. It didn't really damage the face of the card. It just damaged the edges and the corners.
Definitely, in my case, the kids that moved on when they got to be 11, 12 years old, it wasn't really cool anymore. And they would just give me the box of cards that they, because
Exactly.
And I didn't feel like I was ripping them off. I felt like they had no value to them. And frankly, it didn't really have monetary value to me either. It was just fun.
It might have had negative value to them. They may have gotten an extra dessert from their mother who said, wow, you gave them away before I had to throw them away. You got me off the hook. I'm not going to be the bad person in this story. So there's kids that threw them out. There's kids that gave them to another kid or gave them to a younger brother. That happened a lot. But I was the oldest. My younger brother collected, and I wound up not confiscating, but appropriating his cards because he wasn't as into it.
Your memory of the calendar, like when did the first card show up in the 7-Eleven or wherever you bought them?
In my adult life, cards were coming out earlier and earlier, even to December. And that was irritating to me. It's not even in the calendar year. My recollection is when I was a kid, they were coming out by series, but I don't remember the first series coming out when there was snow on the ground in February, when spring training is breaking. My guess is it was spring when you're thinking about baseball, maybe March, and then every 3 weeks or so, you get another series. And I think we went to school up into June. That's why some of these high numbers in last series, if the kids are out of school, that was a big reason why you brought your cards to school. And if you got it, the teacher could confiscate them. If you start playing with them when you're supposed to be listening, then that happened to some kids, but they'd give them back. Otherwise it'd be a felony. There's probably a statute of limitations now, but I'm realizing, how did I get so many cards? I'll tell you one other way. There was a big kid in the neighborhood, and I did not get his cards, but I don't know what you would call this. It wasn't a tournament, wasn't a contest, but he said, you know what? Whoever rakes these leaves for me, they're going to get consideration for some of my cards. And he had a series of things, and he was 3 years older than us. He was the big kid on the block. So he had cards that were older, and several of the kids said, I'll rake all the leaves you want. I want and he had some Bowmans. But I did not win. I don't think it was beneath me. I think it's probably because I moved away, because I wasn't there the whole time. The kid that won had probably lived next door to the guy for his whole life.
My memory of the number of series grew and then shrunk again. But my first year collecting as a 6-year-old was 1967. Like the last series, because there were 7 series, I want to think it was like as late as like late August, maybe Labor Day. That series was coming out. But I think you're right.
For the last series, they were pushing it, and that's one of the reasons they didn't sell as well.
Football cards may have been in the shelves by then.
Yes.
But I think spring training is when I remember seeing cards. This would be the late 60s I'm talking about. So I just was wondering if that changed. When do you remember it being in December? Because I vaguely remember like late 80s, maybe.
Yeah. Does Junk Wax ring a bell? I think they were really elongating the season, and the cards were omnipresent, and it became year round. They were fattening and killing the golden goose. When you're coming out in early December with baseball cards, and the other problem with that,
you want it for Christmas.
That'd probably be a good economic commercial reason for it. But the other thing that did, because at that same time, as you got into the mid 70s, you no longer had cards released by series. And so you're putting them all out. Right. And I think kids were smart, were savvy. They want cards of players that are on the teams that they're going to be playing on. And to jump the gun, if somebody got traded before the season started, but after the cards were produced, because the art in the days of paste up and not digital, the economies and labor saving of some of the digital ways to produce cards now. Graphic design deadlines were in advance of that. And so putting them out in series, and Topps does that now, some with a first series, second series. Hockey does series 1, series 2, extended series based on call-ups or things like that. Football and basketball, not so much, because you're either there or you're not there for the most part. But baseball, that was part of the story of the season, of the late season call-ups, some of the great Willie McCovey coming in, and just these guys that weren't on the opening day rosters. And then next thing you know, they're just killing it. And the prospecting was not as well understood in those days. You didn't have Baseball America, The Athletic. Each major league city had key writers who probably said what the teams wanted them to say to a great degree. They weren't doing exposés. So a lot of positive tone, and they promoted, what they didn't work for the team, but they really tried to promote the sport and to promote their local brand and team.
We talked a little bit about 1956 and even 1958 with the Stan Musial. Let me take you to 1957, testing the limits of your memory. But we know, looking back, that was a pretty historic set in terms of introducing a standard card size, pretty full stats on the back, the color photo, which was a new thing for Topps. So as a second-year collector who didn't really have a lot of precedent, I'm wondering, was there anything when that set came out where you were like, oh, wow, look at this, or, oh, this is crummy, how come the cards are smaller? Did you have any reaction?
Between 56 and 57, we moved. So I had a different set of friends, and I wasn't very into it in my 57 years. So I didn't have very many cards. 58 is where I really got into it. Again, we had not a collecting circle, but my buddies were doing it, and we had a little bit more money with penny packs and nickel packs in those days. So 58, I don't remember anybody griping, grousing about the shrinkage. In fact, I think people griped about candy bars shrinking, same price with a shrunken size as a kind of a price increase by shrinking the treat. But I don't think that was the perception. Again, 57 Topps, beautiful cards, way more beautiful than 58 in my mind. But 57 was not a big collecting year for me. Even 56 was not a big collecting year. 58 is when it was established that this was something that was going to be my primary hobby. And 59, even more, 60, even more, 61, even more. And then there was some dissipation after that. But at Christmas of 59 is when I got my dad's cards. And so when I retroactively apply what that must have meant, it must have meant that I was such a serious collector by Christmas of 59 that my grandmother and grandfather went up into their attic and said, here are your dad's, and probably my uncle's cards too. The cards they had from when they were a kid, which were Goudies and play balls and a nice shoebox full, said, these are for you. They maybe said Merry Christmas because it was at Christmas time and we were visiting them. They lived 500 miles away. So it wasn't like we were just going next door. Probably the only time I ever went to their house because we never lived very close to them. So they must have known that out of all their grandkids, of which they had a bunch, I was the oldest. That helped. And I was the one that was most into baseball at that time and into collecting for sure. And that was pivotal. So, Mark, you're saying, did I go gaga over 57 Topps? No, but 33 Goudy, I thought that's pretty interesting. And 40 and 41 ball, that's pretty interesting. When my dad had been a young teenager, and maybe those could have been his brothers, a little bit younger than him. So when I got the cards in Christmas of 59, I held on to them. I took good care of them. I had more familiarity with them than I did 51 Bowmans. I remember seeing some 53 Bowman colors. As a kid, I didn't think they're beautiful. I thought there's no names on the front. It's a pure card, but what am I going to do with that? You recognized the better players, but I came to love it later. But I don't remember any bluebacks and redbacks, no Topps team cards, no Connie Mack All-Stars. As I dwell back on this, it was neighborhood oriented because when I moved to Chicago, in the Chicago area, they just collected a little different way. And it just was different. Then when I moved back to Wheeling, West Virginia, and that's almost a suburb of Pittsburgh, they were huge Pirate fans there. That's where I was in 1960.
Did you ever have a better Christmas present? That shoebox of cards in 1959? How can you beat that?
I couldn't. I had some other nice Christmas presents over the years, but how many Christmas presents are you going to have that change your life?
Right.
Now that I think I've had two. But that was amazing. But again, I'm not feeling guilty. None of my other cousins or brother or three sisters got an equivalent nice Christmas gift. And yet, the value of that gift at that time would have been $40. In 1959, that box of cards was worth 400 cards at 10 cents a piece. My grandparents were, let's say, upper middle class. Did my brother get a $20 Christmas gift? He probably did. He didn't get a $40 Christmas gift, but $20 was a big deal in 1959. I remember we got like $20. Sometimes we'd get cash, sometimes we get a gift.